What you're about to hear is something your evening news anchor will never say out loud. What the politicians carefully dance around, what the think tanks bury in footnotes, and what the mainstream commentators are too afraid to speak plainly, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Because right now, in real time, the United States of America finds itself standing almost completely alone on the world stage, its hand raised in veto after veto at the United Nations Security Council, shielding one small nation from the collective moral judgment of nearly every other country on Earth. The vote was 14-1, 14 members of the most powerful body in the United Nations, including even Britain, the closest ally Washington has ever had, voting one way, and the United States voting the other. That's not a policy difference, that's isolation. That's something else entirely. And the real question, the question almost nobody in official Washington wants to genuinely answer, is why? Why has the most powerful nation in modern history chosen this particular hill, at this particular moment in history, to stake its global credibility on? What is really driving this? Is it values? Is it strategy? Is it something deeper, something structural, something that runs through the financial architecture and the lobbying corridors and the defense industry balance sheets of this country in ways that most Americans simply haven't been shown? That's what we're going to explore today. And I want to warn you, what follows won't be comfortable, but it will be true. Let's start with the raw numbers because numbers don't lie even when people do. A poll conducted in the spring of 2025 found that Americans now give Israel its lowest favorability rating in polling history dating back to 1978, a lukewarm score of 50 on a scale of 100. More than 6 in 10 Americans said Israel was playing a negative role in resolving the challenges facing the Middle East, up from 54% the year before. Think about what that means. The American public itself, slowly but unmistakably, has begun to turn. And yet the policy hasn't moved, the weapons keep flowing, the vetoes keep coming, the unconditional diplomatic cover remains firmly in place. So there is already, right at the surface of this story, a profound disconnect between what ordinary Americans increasingly feel and believe and what their government continues to do in their name. That gap, that silent yawning contradiction, is the first thing we need to sit with. According to the 2025 Chicago Council survey, pluralities of Americans, including self-described Democrats and independents, now believe the United States is providing Israel with too much support and military aid. More Democrats said the U.S. supports Israel too much, 53%, up from 40% just a year before. Among independents, 42% said too much support, up from 34%. These are not fringe numbers. These are mainstream Americans, people who watch the news, pay their taxes, and vote in every election, looking at what their government is doing and quietly concluding that something is wrong. And yet, the machinery of American foreign policy grinds forward, almost completely indifferent to this shift in the public mood. That tells you something very important about how power actually works in this country, and about who that power ultimately answers to. Now let me be precise about something, because precision matters when we discuss a subject this charged. This is not a conversation about the Jewish people. It is not about anti-Semitism, it is not about religion, and frankly, anyone who tries to reduce it to those terms is trying to prevent you from thinking clearly. This is a conversation about a specific government, its specific policies, and the specific foreign policy decisions of the United States government that serves as that government's primary benefactor and diplomatic guardian. Those are political and financial relationships, and they deserve to be examined with the same hard analytical eye we'd apply to any other political and financial relationship. The moment we accept that one particular alliance is somehow beyond scrutiny, beyond normal democratic accountability, beyond the ordinary cost-benefit analysis we apply to everything else, that's the moment we've surrendered something important. That's the moment we've agreed to be something less than an informed citizenry. So let's talk about the structure of this relationship, because it is extraordinary by any measure. The current 10-year U.S.-Israel Memorandum of Understanding signed under President Obama provides $38 billion in military aid, and that agreement is now nearing expiration. $38 billion. That's a number worth pausing on. That's not foreign assistance in the traditional sense, food, medicine, development aid. That is military hardware, weapon systems, and the financial infrastructure of war transferred from American taxpayers to a foreign government year after year, decade after decade, regardless of what that foreign government does with it. And here's what makes this particular arrangement unique in the entire history of American foreign policy. there is virtually no conditionality attached to it. Almost every other foreign aid relationship the United States has comes with strings: human rights benchmarks, democratic governance requirements, transparency conditions. With Israel, those strings have historically not been there. Or when they have been attached, they have been quietly and quickly removed. The Trump administration's approach has been even more explicitly transactional than its predecessors. It has prioritized trade deals and strategic alliances, particularly with Gulf states, over the enforcement of international legal norms. In January, Trump issued an executive order authorizing sanctions on the International Criminal Court over what he called its illegitimate actions against the US and its close ally Israel. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States sanctioned the judges of an international court, the institution that the world created after World War II specifically to ensure that the powerful could never again slaughter civilians with complete impunity, because that court had the audacity to apply its own rules to an American ally. That is an extraordinary thing to do. That is a country telling the rest of the world the law applies to everyone except our friends. And it is worth asking, very seriously, how long the rest of the world is going to accept that premise, because the rest of the world is clearly not accepting it anymore. On September 17, 2025, the ICC's pre-trial chamber issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, citing reasonable grounds to suspect war crimes and crimes against humanity. For Israel's leadership, that decision effectively wiped 124 countries off their safe travel map. 124 countries? That is not a fringe movement. That is not a collection of hostile regimes acting out of ideological spite. That is the majority of the world operating through the legitimate institutions of international law, saying that what has happened in Gaza cannot be classified as normal warfare and that the people responsible for it must answer for it. The United States' response to that judgment was to sanction the judges, to try to financially punish individual human beings for doing the job that an international legal institution was created to do. If you want a single image that captures where American credibility stands in the world right now, that might be it. And the isolation is not merely symbolic. At the United Nations General Assembly, 142 of 164 countries voted to endorse a French and Saudi plan for Palestinian statehood over Israeli and American objections. When comparing key UN votes from 2017 to 2025, countries that once abstained, Australia, Canada, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, the United Kingdom, have now shifted to voting against the US-Israeli position. These are not adversaries. These are the countries that form the core of the post-war Western alliance. These are the countries that built NATO with the United States, that stood shoulder to shoulder through the Cold War, that followed Washington into Iraq and Afghanistan. And now, one by one, they are separating themselves on this issue. They are doing something politically costly, breaking with Washington, because they have decided that the cost of continuing to back the US position has become greater than the cost of opposing it. That is a profound geopolitical signal that most Americans are not being given the tools to understand. Why are Germany, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, America's closest friends, lining up against Washington's position at the UN? The answer, when you strip away the diplomatic language, is simple. They are looking at what is happening in Gaza. They are looking at the casualty figures. They are looking at the famine conditions. They are looking at the ruined hospitals and the buried children. And they are concluding that they cannot continue to publicly support it without catastrophic damage to their own credibility and moral standing at home and abroad. Their publics will not allow it. Their own legal frameworks are beginning to restrict it. Slovenia imposed a total weapons embargo on Israel in August 2025. Spain placed a total embargo on exports and imports of defense materials. Italy suspended new arms export licenses. The Netherlands halted F-35 parts shipments. Belgium expanded restrictions to include arms transit through its territory. Europe is not cutting ties with the United States, but Europe is clearly and deliberately distinguishing its own position from Washington's on this specific issue, and that distinction is going to have long-term consequences for the architecture of Western alliance politics. Now here is where the deeper structural question begins. Why is Washington so resistant to the pressure that has moved every other major democratic government? The standard answer you'll hear from official Washington is strategic. Israel is a key ally, a democracy in a difficult region, an intelligence partner, a node of military technology. And there is truth in some of that. Israel is a co-developer of missile defense systems, including the Iron Dome, a significant contributor to cybersecurity infrastructure that protects US systems, and a source of intelligence on Iran, Hezbollah, and other actors in the region. These are real strategic assets, and an honest analysis has to acknowledge them, but they don't fully explain the extraordinary degree of unconditional protection that Washington extends, because the US maintains deep strategic relationships with many countries without extending that level of protection. The relationship with Saudi Arabia, for instance, another country with a complicated human rights record, is explicitly conditional and transactional. When Riyadh does something Washington genuinely disapproves of, there are consequences. With Israel, the consequences have historically not materialized in the same way. So what accounts for the difference? Part of the answer lies in domestic political architecture. The lobbying infrastructure around US-Israel policy is, by any objective measure, one of the most powerful and well-organized in American political history. Not because of any conspiracy, not because of any ethnic or religious cabal, just because a well-funded, well-organized, politically sophisticated advocacy network has spent decades cultivating relationships on both sides of the aisle, embedding itself in the donor infrastructure of both major parties, and making support for Israel a prerequisite for political advancement in Washington in a way that support for virtually no other foreign policy position is. That is a straightforward political science observation. It is not anti-Semitic to note it. It is simply how American politics works, and the Israel lobby is far from unique in deploying these tactics. The defense industry does the same thing. The pharmaceutical industry does the same thing. The financial sector does the same thing. The difference is that in those cases, Americans have generally been allowed to talk about it openly. Among a segment of the MAGA coalition, there are now loud voices expressing severe anti-Semitic views tied to Israel, and the concern within that camp is that Israel is an exploitative country that tries to manipulate the United States into fighting its wars, not necessarily in accordance with American interests, weakening the United States in its competition for global hegemony. Now, I am not endorsing that view, but I am noting that even within the political movement that is currently most enthusiastic about maintaining the alliance, there are fissures and they are widening. The political unanimity that once characterized Washington's approach to Israel, the absolute bipartisan consensus that would end careers if broken, is fracturing. And it is fracturing precisely because ordinary Americans on both the left and the right are beginning to ask the question that their political leaders have long tried to prevent them from asking: is this relationship, as currently structured, actually in America's interests? That is a legitimate question. It is, in fact, a necessary question for any democracy to ask about any foreign relationship. And the data increasingly suggests the answer is more complicated than the official story allows. The 2025 US National Security Strategy marks a profound shift, not through disengagement, but through more conditional support, reduced involvement, and growing expectations for Israeli strategic independence. It declares that the Middle East will no longer dominate US foreign policy in day-to-day planning and execution. Even within the Trump administration, which has been effusively supportive of Netanyahu at the rhetorical and personal level, there is a recognition at the strategic planning level that American overextension in the Middle East has costs that can no longer simply be ignored. The resources committed to that region, the military deployments, the diplomatic capital, the financial transfers, are resources that are not being used in the competition with China that most serious American strategists consider to be the central challenge of the coming decades. Since early 2025, EU-US relations have been increasingly tense over NATO, Greenland, Ukraine, trade, technology, climate, and China, indicating a deeper split in strategic visions across the Atlantic. The United States is simultaneously managing a fracturing relationship with Europe, a rising confrontation with China, an ongoing war in Ukraine, and its role as the primary diplomatic and military backer of Israel's operations in Gaza, and now its strikes against Iran. These are not separate stories. They are all part of the same story, which is a story about the limits of American power and the cost of trying to maintain an imperial posture in a world that is rapidly reorganizing itself. The countries of the global south, and increasingly the countries of Europe, are watching the United States wield its UN veto to protect a military campaign that they believe violates international law, and they are drawing conclusions about what American leadership actually means in practice. Israel's large-scale attack against Iran on June 13, 2025, conducted without UN Security Council approval, has prompted retaliation from Tehran and further isolated institutions like the UN, the ICC, and the ICJ, which have found themselves increasingly sidelined, The world appears to be facing an unprecedented upending of the post-1945 international legal order. That is not a marginal concern, that is a civilizational concern. The international order that was built after World War II, imperfect as it was, hypocritical as it often was, provided a framework within which disputes could be managed, wars could be restrained, and the weakest states had at least some recourse to law and institution. That framework is being systematically dismantled right now. And the United States, the country that did more than any other to build it, is among the most active forces in tearing it down. The long-term consequences of that demolition for American security, for global stability, for the basic architecture of international relations are incalculable and almost certainly severe. Younger Americans, policymakers, technologists, investors, do not inherit the same emotional connection to Israel as previous generations. Their worldview is shaped by platforms, algorithms, and global narratives that often flatten complexity, and what they see when they look at those platforms and those algorithms is not the strategic briefings and the intelligence assessments and the decades of Cold War alliance building that shaped the worldview of the generation that made this policy. What they see is the real-time images of what is happening, and they are reaching different conclusions. A June 2025 Quinnipiac poll found only 37% of Americans now sympathize more with Israelis, while 32% back Palestinians and 31% are unsure. A sharp drop from earlier years when majorities sided firmly with Israel. Even among Republicans, support has slipped from 78% in 2024 to 64%. These trends do not reverse. Generational shifts in political opinion are among the most durable forces in democratic politics. What is happening right now in American public opinion on this issue will shape congressional elections, presidential politics, and ultimately foreign policy itself, probably within the next decade, possibly sooner. The world is at an inflection point, and the United States is at a decision point within that inflection. The question is whether it will be capable of honest self-examination, whether the democratic machinery of this country can overcome the special interests, the lobbying infrastructure, the career incentives, and the sheer institutional inertia that has kept this policy frozen in place for decades, and ask the genuinely hard question, what does America actually owe and to whom and at what cost? That is not an anti-American question, it is the most American question there is. A country that cannot examine its own foreign policy honestly is not a democracy in any meaningful sense. It is a managed narrative, and the people of this country deserve better than a managed narrative. They deserve the truth about what is being done in their name, with their money, and at the cost of their standing in the world. That accounting is coming. The only question is whether it will be chosen deliberately through honest democratic debate, or whether it will be forced upon this country by the weight of events that have already been set in motion.